Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Can you all hear me? Please let me know, by the way, as we go along, if you can't hear me or if I'm mumbling or speaking too fast. I recently spoke to a group of high school teachers, and at the end we got the evaluation, and half of them said I mumbled, and I felt really bad. So I'd like to express my appreciation to teachers, and also to all of the folks at the Silicon Valley Korean School, and those from the Consulate and the Korean Foundation who are supporting them. We've already talked quite a bit about why it's worth knowing something about Korea in today's world. We have Korean American students. South Korea is quite a major country these days, economically, culturally, as an economic development model, as a political development model for many countries throughout the world. And Dr. Peterson also talked about the contrast between the situation in South Korea and the situation in North Korea. And after I returned, I was in government for 30 years, and when I came back to school again at Stanford, I learned that the social scientists have a word for this. They call this a natural experiment, because it's so hard, of course, in the social sciences to have real experiments, unlike the hard sciences. So where you can have a situation where you have a society like South Korea that was open to the world and that had a relatively open domestic system, and then one in the north which was had a Stalinist type system. So you can compare the development. It's very dramatic. Another reason that I think it's important to know about Korea, especially for Americans, is that South Korea, as it's been mentioned, is an ally, a treaty ally of the United States. So if North Korea again invaded South Korea, the United States is obligated to help North Korea. And while I, and I think most people who study Korea, believe that the risk of war on the Korean Peninsula is quite small, if it occurred, it could be very devastating. And of course, another reason to study Korea is that Korea is in the news all the time, especially North Korea. So you may have students, especially in high school in social sciences or history, who would be interested in looking at the North Korea situation. So that's what I'm going to do for the next 50 minutes or so, look at North Korea. But please, as I go through this, I have my outline, and I've been looking at this for 30 years, but I don't have a prepared text. So I'll modify this as we go along. And if you have questions as we go along, stick your hand up. If you disagree or have a different point of view, that's great too, okay? So, I'm going to talk about 5 things. In order to understand the North Korea problem, as it's sometimes called, it's important to know a little bit about the history of the Korean Peninsula. And so I will do that as it relates to North Korea. Second, we'll look very briefly at the situation in North Korea today. And third, we'll look at the relationship between North and South Korea. Fourth, we'll discuss North Korea's relationship with its neighbors and the U.S. And even though geographically the United States is not a neighbor, because of the treaty relationship with South Korea, because of the United States' power in the world and historical involvement in Northeast Asia, in a way the United States is a neighbor of North Korea. And finally, we'll speculate for a moment together about what the future might hold on the Korean Peninsula. So, history of Korea as it relates to North Korea today. Dr. Peterson has already got into some of this, but the northern half of the Korean Peninsula was part of a unified Korean nation state from 1918 until 1945. Now, there were previous unified Koreas, but I think this was the first time it's in more or less the current borders, okay? So even taking a minimalistic view of Korea's history as a unified nation, you've got over 1,000 years of history as a unified nation-state within roughly its current borders. Compare that to most other countries in the world. Germany, Italy, only in the last couple of hundred years were unified, right? And so this is quite a distinctive thing. And it's because Korea is located on a peninsula, it's fairly understandable that there would be this degree of unity. And thus very unnatural for there to be a division, especially after 1,000 years of unity. But division is exactly what happened. The Japanese, as they developed Western technology faster than Korea in the 19th century, became quite powerful, and copying the Western powers to a considerable extent became imperialistic and aggressive. And one of their early targets was Korea, in competition with China, which had formal suzerainty over Korea for a long time, but had not really interfered much in Korean affairs, and with the Western powers, such as Russia and England. And Japan fought two wars. I'm sorry, there were two major wars fought about 100 years ago over Korea. There was the war in 1894 and 95, the Sino-Japanese War between those two countries. Japan won that, and its influence on the Korean Peninsula became much more powerful. It basically excluded much of China's influence at that point. And then in 1904, 1905, Japan fought a war with Russia, Imperial Russia, and to the shock of not only the Russians, but most Western nations, defeated Russia. And it was at that point that the Japanese began to completely take over Korea. And in 1910, Japan formally colonized Korea. This was not a popular thing in Korea. Koreans were proud of their nation and its history, and did not particularly like the Japanese. And so most Koreans bitterly resented this. And at different times during this period from 1910 until the end of the World War II in the Pacific, Japanese rule at times was very, very harsh in Korea. Now, the mythology that the Japanese empire created for itself was that Koreans were going to be citizens, were citizens just like Japanese, but they were second-class citizens. Of course, with the end of the World War II, the United States defeated Japan and felt some responsibility for countries like Korea. And the Russians, the Soviets that is, had joined the war against Japan at the very end. And American policymakers were concerned that the Soviets would occupy the entire country, the entire peninsula of Korea. And so, almost as an afterthought, we, the United States, proposed to the Soviets that we divide the peninsula along the 38th parallel temporarily for the purpose of maintaining order in Korea as the Japanese forces withdrew and as the Koreans had time to organize themselves to create their own state. Well, of course, the Cold War intervened, and it became impossible to find agreement between the Soviets and the Americans and the regimes that they helped to install in both North and South Korea. And so this very unnatural division of the Korean Peninsula, the Korean nation, was held. And so this began in 1945. By 1947, it was clear this was not going to be erased anytime soon. The Americans, having fought in both the Atlantic theater and the Pacific theater, were more than eager to get out of Korea. Americans up to then had no real contact with Korea and no real interest in Korea. And so the United States helped to establish a regime in South Korea that was nominally democratic, led by a man who was educated at Princeton and spent a long time living as an exile in the United States, called Syngman Rhee or Lee Sun-man. And also, just about the same time, the Soviets installed a former, very young guerrilla fighter against the Japanese named Kim Il-sung as the leader of North Korea. This was an accident of history. Could have happened any of a number of other ways. That is, how North Korea got the regime that it did. So you can see how young he is. He's not much older here than his grandson Kim Jong-un was a couple of years ago when he became the supreme leader of North Korea. This young man was a communist by training. He had worked with the communist Chinese and helped them fight against the Chinese nationalists and against Japan. And he was also an officer in the Soviet military towards this period. When the Korean War broke out on June 25th, 1950, the American reaction was this was a Soviet plot. Later on, a lot of revisionist historians said, no, 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 this was a civil war, this between North and South. Well, there's a lot of truth to both of those. And I'm not prepared and not able to debate what percentage of Kim Il-sung was nationalist and what percentage was communist. It was both. We now have historical records from the Soviet archives and Eastern European archives and others that prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that Kim Il-sung took the initiative to propose to the Soviets a Korean war, an invasion of South Korea to unify the peninsula under his leadership. And he persuaded Stalin to support him on one condition. Stalin said, you have to go to Mao Zedong and get him to support you in case it's necessary. And he did. And so the invasion began in June of 1950. And the South was very unprepared. There were no American forces left in South Korea at that time other than about 500 military advisors, no combat forces. So within a few weeks, the North Korean forces with Soviet tanks and Soviet arms had nearly occupied the entire peninsula. There was only one little corner around the southeastern coast, the Busan perimeter, that held. The United States immediately intervened because it saw this as a Soviet plot, which in part it was. And after much going backwards and forwards, the line became pretty much steady, very close to the 38th parallel again, around 1951. And there was fighting that went on quite a bit between 51 and 53, but at the same time there were peace talks, and eventually, after Stalin died, it became possible to sign an armistice agreement. Not a peace treaty, but an armistice agreement. The fighting stopped, but there was no real mechanism to ensure the peace. This war, on top of the Cold War division, was devastating. Devastating to the people. Millions of people were killed, injured, lost their homes, their livelihoods. So on top of those two terrible invasions that Dr. Peterson was talking about, this, I guess, is a third that ranks right up there. And in North Korea, it was particularly bad. Even though the North Koreans were responsible for launching this war, the Americans, first to try to defeat them and then just to maintain South Korea's autonomy, the United States bombed the North incredibly. I've seen figures, I can't remember the exact statistics, but the United States dropped an incredible number of bombs all over North Korea. There were eventually no targets left, essentially. We even bombed dams, which would be considered a war crime today. And the North Koreans, of course, no matter, they don't know, the people don't know that their leaders launched the war. To this day, the North Korean leaders say that the Americans launched the war. So all the North Koreans remember is that not only did the Americans launch the war, but they laid waste to their homes and their cities. So you can imagine how that, what kind of impediment, what kind of a burden that puts on any attempt to have a relationship between North Korea and the United States. So this is what I've been talking about. This has really made the division very difficult. It's not just the way the North Koreans feel about the United States, but North Koreans and South Koreans fought each other. Most of the human beings in uniform fighting each other in the Korean War were South Koreans and North Koreans. Well, on the northern side, there were huge numbers of Chinese who entered the war at the end of 1950. But huge, the North Koreans and South Koreans were fighting against each other. So if you think of the American Civil War, where American politics today, even today, is affected indirectly by the divisions and animosities and partisanship that caused the Civil War and that were exacerbated by the Civil War, and that was 150 years ago. So this is a third of this time in the past. So you can imagine again how much of a burden this creates. This situation continued, but more or less the same. That is, the North-South Korea division was part of the Cold War complex of issues. But about 20 years or so ago, when the Cold War was ending, the Soviet Union collapsed, and coincidentally, China began moving from a bizarre communist system to a much more market-oriented economy and a much more open and pragmatic leadership style. This was a real disaster for North Korea. Why? Because even before then, the Chinese and the Soviets really didn't like North Korea. North Korea was a very difficult regime. The regime was extremely nationalistic. They didn't like foreigners very much. The ideology in North Korea is that Koreans are a pure race, victimized by outside powers. The regime in North Korea is a pure regime. The one in South Korea is a very impure regime because it was created by people who had collaborated with the Japanese colonizers and was set up by the American imperialists. Okay? So the Soviets, when the Soviet Union no longer existed, the Russians, especially the first 5 or 6 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't want to have anything to do with North Korea. They regarded it as a ridiculous, primitive place, and they were focused on their own problems. So all of this tremendous amount of aid and support that used to come from the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe to North Korea ended almost completely, almost overnight. And China's support, which was more limited, also was reduced because the Chinese became very focused on doing things for the market. And the North Koreans had no market and no money. So North Korea went from a situation in which everybody was poor, but very few people starved to death, to sort of a panic situation because of the adjustment was so abrupt that a famine, a large, a major famine occurred in the mid-1990s. And to this day, we still don't have a good fix on how many people starved to death. But I think probably some of the best estimates are roughly 500,000 people. And it's complicated because people weren't counting very well. The regime doesn't want this information known. A lot of people, when you're so malnourished, you often die not of malnourishment, but of getting diseases, so-called opportunistic diseases. It was a terrible, terrible time. The North Korean regime refers to it as the long or arduous march, the arduous march. So you have a very, very weak North Korean regime facing South Korea. And South Korea in this period, we're talking about 20 years ago, has just become democratic. It has already become a major economic and trading nation. It is allied with the world's only superpower, the United States, and is gaining even more and more respect throughout the world. North Korea has none of this. Everything is on the other extreme of bad. So what do? Well, they do a number of things, but one of the things that we focus on a lot, especially in the United States, is to compensate for this overwhelming weakness. They have been working on nuclear weapons, but they accelerated their work on nuclear weapons and missile programs. You need missiles to deliver these nuclear weapons. So that became a very, very big issue for the United States, and to some extent for South Korea and Japan, from the late 1980s. And we had our first so-called nuclear crisis with North Korea, 1993 to 1994. Some of you may remember that. Eventually, Jimmy Carter, as a former president, went to North Korea and saw Kim Il-sung, this unprecedented, huge, dramatic thing. And that created a basis for an agreement between the U.S. and North Korea that eventually North Korea would give these programs up in exchange for help from the United States. That lasted about 10 years, and we'll get into that in a moment. Dr. Peterson showed you this in a larger context earlier, but that's the situation that the North Korean regime was facing, and to a considerable extent faces today. So now we're looking at North Korea today. Actually, this is from about a year or so ago, but it's close enough. And, you know, the North Koreans will say that the greatest threat to not only North Korea, but to the people of North and South Korea, to the Korean nation, is the United States and its imperialism. I believe that the North Koreans, actually the leaders, when they're talking among themselves, know that over the long term, the real threat to North Korea, that is from the outside, comes from the existence of a very successful South Korean state. The North Korean regime is founded on the notion that it is the only legitimate Korean state, because, as I mentioned before, the one in the south allegedly was set up by all these Koreans who collaborated with imperialist Japan and with the aid and support of the imperialist United States. So their North Korea is legitimate. Their North Korea is truly Korean, truly pure. But earlier, the North Koreans also said that theirs was the successful Korea. And for a period in the 50s and 60s, maybe even the early 70s, the average North Korean may have had, you know, more food to eat or better shelter than the average South Korean. But today, we've already seen there's no comparison between the standard of living in North and South Korea. So that's a big blow to the mythology of the North Korean state. And in today's world, the idea that to be legitimate, you have to be racially pure. Now, to be fair, in South Korea, until fairly recently, the idea of being members of a unified people, that is ethnically, was state ideology. But the South Koreans have given up on it, as they have become among the most educated people in the world, among the most traveled people in the world, among the most sophisticated people in the world. South Koreans and their government have recognized that we are all essentially the same, and that to have an ideology, to make as the foundational myth of your government and of your state, that you're all from the same ancestor, is anachronistic, to say the least. And the North Koreans have to deal with all of these changes, but they're locked into an existential struggle with another Korean state that is far more successful. So you can imagine that the leaders of North Korea, the ones who have real power and authority, probably don't sleep very well at night, trying to figure out how to deal with these issues. leaders of North Korea really know how poor their country is. Now, probably the average North Korean doesn't, although more and more information because of the Internet revolution is beginning to get into the ordinary people of North Korea. But the leaders of North Korea are smart as we are, and many of them have traveled in the world, and they have a lot more access to information than ordinary people do. They know that they have failed in their systemic competition with the South Koreans. And they know, therefore, that they have to do something to recover from this. And so, part of their own rationale for developing nuclear weapons and missiles was that we are threatened by the Americans. Now, in fact, they're not, and if anyone wants to discuss why they're not, I'll be happy to discuss that. A lot of observers would disagree, but I'm convinced that the United States is not a military threat to North Korea. The United States is only interested in preventing another war on the Korean Peninsula, and short of a war, trying to stop the North Koreans from continuing to develop nuclear weapons. But the North Korean leaders know that they have to build their economy. And so they have said to themselves that if we have nuclear weapons, we no longer have to worry as much about the military threat from the United States and South Korea. We can devote more resources to our economy. And they have a new term for that. It's called parallel progress, Dongjin. In other words, continue with the nuclear development and work on building up the economy. So they know that if they're really going to build up their economy, they have to have two things. They have to have domestic reform of their system. Their current system is still based on an old Stalinist state-controlled economy, a central economy. They also know that they have to have capital, and they don't have enough capital inside their country, so they know they have to get foreign capital. But when it comes to opening up their system, going away from the Stalinist system, the leaders of North Korea are smart enough to know that if they do that, what's going to happen? One of the first things that's going to happen is that the people of North Korea will learn that the Americans and the South Koreans did not start the Korean War. And it will begin from there. And there will be a complete re-examination of the propaganda that the people of North Korea have been force-fed by their regime for the past 70 years. So the leaders of North Korea are deeply fearful that if they open up very much at all, that their own people will eventually rise up against them. As evidence for this, look at Kim Jong-il, the previous leader of North Korea. He repeatedly visited China. The Chinese took him to all of their new factories and economic zones and were trying to get him to adopt Chinese-style reforms. Not full political democracy, but Chinese-style economic reforms. Kim Jong-il was always suitably impressed, according to reports, but he rarely and only in very limited ways instituted any economic reforms. Why? Because he was smart enough to fear the consequences on the political side. As for foreign capital, if you're a foreign businessman and you're looking at about 200 countries in the world in which to invest apart from your own, are you going to invest in a North Korea that is known throughout the world for having a totalitarian political system? And for a country that is now under international sanctions, United Nations Security Council sanctions, for developing nuclear weapons? Very few businessmen, international businessmen so far, have been interested in North Korea, and I think that will remain the case in the future as long as North Korea does not open up domestically and as long as it continues to insist on having nuclear weapons.
That North Korea knew it needed to devote itself to economic progress, and that the Americans conspiratorially combined with the South Koreans to do the recent military exercises in order to provoke the North Koreans into bolstering the military development in order to siphon off money that could otherwise have been spent to economic growth and make them have to money on the military to defend themselves. And so what they were planning to do was a very balanced division of military and economic growth, but that it was clearly the Americans' fault for being provocative in order to prevent them from becoming the economic powerhouse they otherwise would be.
There's a grain of truth in that.
It was, from their perspective, it
Yeah.
was plausible, and they had just done these military exercises with South Korea, which we saw as responding to their provocation.
Yeah, you can, and some smart people, including in the United States, have developed this narrative in which which essentially is grounded in the North Koreans being victims of South Korean conservatives, victims of the United States. And that the North Koreans have, yes, they've acted very badly at times, but it's always been, or almost always been, in response.
Yeah, that's it.
You can make a narrative, and of course the North Koreans, it's in their self-interest to do that, and probably a lot of North Korean leaders actually feel that way.
Certainly the tour guides did.
I'm sure they did. I myself, of course, most Americans almost instinctively would reject that. I think I reject that because as someone who was open, I'm very open to, trying to be critical of my country to help to make it a better country. So I kept my mind open for a long time. And while occasionally you can say that the U.S. or South Korea acted badly, if you look at the whole arc of this history, I would argue that essentially the root of the problem on the Korean Peninsula today is the history, the origin, the nature of the North Korean system. But it's a very complex situation.